Hi everyone, this is lesson 7 in your remote learning series for A Christmas Carol. We're still on stave 3 and we're going to be looking at the character of Tiny Tim and the Cratchit family that he's a part of as well. Okay, so at this point we've just met the ghost of Christmas Present. And he is now taking Scrooge to see the Cratchit family. And remember, Bob Cratchit is the clerk who is employed by Scrooge. We met him in stave 1. So the ghost shows the impoverished family, so the family are living in poverty, to teach Scrooge the importance of family, as well as showing him that money isn't everything. There's more to life than just money. Okay. So Miss Wan's going to take this first quote for us.
Okay, so at this point, Ghost of Christmas Present shows the Cratchit family. We're going to get you to read some of the text, so you'll probably understand at this point that we understand that the Cratchit family are very loving, nurturing towards each other, and they're waiting for Bob Cratchit, their dad, to come back home from church. And he is with his youngest son, Tiny Tim. And they're talking about something that Tiny Tim says as on the way home. He told me coming home that he hoped that people saw him in church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day he made lame beggars walk and blind men see. So you might know by now that Tiny Tim is a young child with a physical disability, which is why he always walks around with a crutch. He is quite sickly as well, but despite his suffering, he is presented in a very positive and idealized way, and he is very different to Scrooge in the sense that he is, like I said, very positive, but also quite wise for a young child. And he says that he hopes and is happy for people to see his handicap because he feels that when they're at church, that it might benefit the congregation, because he hopes that his suffering will remind them of Christ and thus make them happy at Christmas. And he says it might be pleasant for them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. And that's an allusion to the fact that Jesus healed the blind, and he made a paralyzed man walk. I think it's a reference to the New Testament. So it could be this illusion that maybe, I don't know if you come to that, Tiny Tim could be some sort of like miracle in the sense that he's still alive, and that a reminder of the good that God can do. I think seeing him at church again, talking about the embodiment of the values of Christianity versus the organisation of it. So like we said, often the Victorians would go to church on a Sunday and believe that, you know, on surface value that they were seen as good Christians. But I think Tyson saying this shows them that actually it's a bit more to it than that. It's about being more showing goodwill to others. He is also, I think, somebody that is quite happy despite their situation, and despite his youthfulness. I think he is the opposite of Scrooge in the sense that Scrooge has no wisdom at all because he's not had to suffer, I think, and therefore he remains ignorant. Not much more I can say to that. If there's something
the other thing I would probably add is this reference to the blind men seeing. So as Ms. Wan said, it is not only a reference to Jesus and his ability to heal, but obviously we could take that in reference to Scrooge and how Scrooge being shown the Cratchit family, and in particular Tiny Tim and his condition and how he's suffering as a result of Scrooge's selfishness. If obviously in Victorian times there wasn't the NHS and you could only get access to medical help if you were rich, obviously the Cratchit family aren't. so they can't afford to pay for medical treatment to help Tiny Tim. And it's this idea, again, we're going back to things that we've already covered within Stave 1, this idea that Scrooge is metaphorically blind to the sufferings of others because it doesn't affect him directly. So him seeing the Cratchit family with Christmas present is kind of, again, opening his eyes and making him see how his selfishness is impacting others. All right?
That's excellent.
So that kind of brings me nicely onto the next quote. So this is kind of after the Cratchit family Christmas, and Scrooge is kind of again starting to warm up, and he asks about Tiny Tim, and I think he says, will Tiny Tim live, or will he be spared, or something like that. And the ghost says, I see a vacant seat, replied the ghost, in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. So obviously this is suggesting that, again, if Scrooge has and this is a reference to Fezziwig in Stave 2, where Scrooge says that he has the power to render us happy or unhappy. And this is the same with Scrooge. So Scrooge has the power to render people or make people happy or unhappy. And it is essentially up to Scrooge to make sure that Tiny Tim doesn't die. Obviously, this is a wider message to the wider audience of Dickens. And again, with Scrooge being a construct of the Victorian rich and a symbol of them, he's not just addressing this to Scrooge, he's addressing it to his wider reader and telling them, you know, if you have the power and the ability to be charitable and give to those who are less fortunate, you have a responsibility to do that. You have a social responsibility or a social duty to do that. We've kind of got this idea of emptiness here, so the vacant seat, something without an owner. So it's this idea that for Scrooge doesn't value family. So he's not, even though he has a nephew who is present and in good health, he doesn't value him. Whereas the Cratchits, even though they're poor, they value each other and the relationships they have with each other. So, and the fact that the crutch would be carefully preserved, obviously if you preserve something, it's kind of keeping it in kind of in a good condition. So it shows that you know, the crutch of Tiny Tim would be remembered and kind of used as almost like a shrine almost to kind of show their love for him. And then we've got this reference to shadows. So if these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. And there's a reference to shadows later on. Again, it's this idea of darkness kind of coming in and overtaking the light. So again, if Scrooge doesn't change, any hope that or any positivity that the Cratchit family will have will kind of be overtaken by darkness. And you can see that later on in Stave 4, when Tiny Tim's death is foreshadowed by the ghost of Christmas yet to come. You can also take this, the child will die. So it's almost being used like as an imperative. It's not that he might die, he's saying that he will die. So again, that kind of emphasises Scrooge's selfishness and the impacts of his selfishness and his cruelty. So if he doesn't change, he's essentially got blood on his hands, which is again perhaps a message to wider society about, like Miss Wan said about religion. You know, yeah, you might go to church every Sunday, but that doesn't mean that you're a good person or a good Christian or embody those values. So it's kind of making Scrooge reflect on his selfishness and his greed, and how if that continues, then any hope for anyone, not just Scrooge, for the Cratchits, for Fred, etc., that will be overtaken by metaphorical darkness. Is there anything that you can add to that?
So yeah, one thing is possibly the connotations of a child and a bit of a deeper connection to what you said about social duty. So when we look at the connotations of a child, it's somebody that is quite vulnerable and fragile, and innocent. And I think there's kind of a couple of things that I could sort of think about in terms of the social duty message, which is that if Scrooge is the construct and embodiment of the Victorian wealthy, and it is his social duty to look after the poor, then Tiny Tim could represent the working class child. And now you might know from your contextual work in lesson that it was a common thing for street children or working class children to basically work labour as cheap labour, and I think Dickens sees this particular part of the population as the most vulnerable because they are effectively children, and therefore it's Scrooge's duty to protect children like Tiny Tim from this sort of tragic outcome. And therefore, when he says the child will die, he's sort of referring to, if we continue not helping, then children will suffer, and they will be the ones that are sort of what's the word? The victims of selfishness. I guess sometimes maybe a child could link to the childhood as well. These kids don't have a childhood, so
you kind of have to grow up quickly.
So there's a loss of innocence there as well, and I think could allude to the child will die. So I think there's like a social justice message here about sort of how far-reaching consequences can be, because children are helpless, and Tiny Tim, that's why he's kind of seen as quite weak and fragile, because of the effects of not being helped. But despite that, seems to see very ideal, has a very idealistic outlook, and which kind of makes you sort of root for the working class family. Because I think a couple of lessons ago we talked about how working class people were viewed and they were seen as idle, and I think that was dangerous because then that sort of put people off from helping, and therefore I think Dickens presents a romanticised view. You could criticise and say that maybe it's too romanticised, but maybe it's necessary because too many people thought that working class people deserve to work in workhouses, or they deserve to be sort of labelled as deviants, and that's not true, because we've got a child that, despite his suffering, wants other people to benefit from his suffering, to sort of help others, or the Cratchit family themselves. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the third and final quote. So this is at the very end of this section where the Ghost of Christmas Present is showing Scrooge, the Cratchit family, and Bob Cratchit raises a toast to Scrooge because he labels him as the founder of the feast. So essentially he paid Bob's wages to enable them to have a Christmas dinner together. And Mrs. Cratchit does not take kindly to this. She reprimands Bob for labelling him as the founder of the feast, which is suggestive of generosity, which she knows that he isn't. So later on after this, it says Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. Do you want me to say it?
Maybe you start.
All right. So obviously, the most obvious thing that we can say was this idea that Scrooge was the ogre of the family. So an ogre is essentially a monster. Think about Shrek. Someone who is very ugly, someone who is kind of shunned from normal society. And it's this idea that kind of Scrooge's actions and his treatment of, obviously think of a monster as something inhuman. So Scrooge is almost being dehumanized and stripped of his humanity by Mrs. Cratchit in particular because of his inhumane treatment, arguably, of Bob. And the fact that, again, an ogre has connotations of kind of monstrosity and kind of destructive behaviour. We could argue that Scrooge's lack of empathy, his lack of kindness, his lack of a decent wage for Bob is causing the family to suffer. You know, if you think of an ogre or a monster, it would cause suffering, be that mental or physical or emotional. So this use of the metaphor here is kind of almost kind of emphasising in quite a hyperbolic way that Scrooge's actions are almost inhuman, and the way that he goes about life is inhuman. And obviously that is Dickens very strongly condemning people like him and how they treat others.
Yeah, really good interpretation of the metaphor ogre. I think I was looking at the cast of dark shadows, the second metaphor, and I think again it links to these constructs, and I think the idea that he's got that power, but the fact that it casts a dark shadow sort of foreshadows the bleaker consequences of his actions. Like, you know, the ghost of Christmas Present says that he sees a vacant seat. You know, he ultimately, if he doesn't pay his dad, Bob Cratchit, Tiny Tim's dad, a fair wage, then they can't afford to pay for medical care because there was nothing in society to assist people when they needed it. So him as a person that was wealthy enough, he had the power to help alleviate the pain of this family. So when we sort of cast a dark shadow, if he continues in the same path as he is now, then it's not just he now will fully realise the impact of his decisions and the fact that he cares about this vulnerable child. Like I said, it stems right down to the most innocent. And I don't think he realises that until he sees Tiny Tim, until he sees Cratchit family, and he sees, despite that his actions, that they do love each other, but they have very little.
I think the fact that as well, it's just the mention of his name that casts the shadow, that, you know, it's kind of like everything about him is kind of repulsive and kind of has a negative impact, even just his name. So it's not the presence of him. Obviously, he's looking at it as though he were there, but they can't see him. So it's just, it just shows the kind of the severity or the gravity of the impact that he has. Even his name is kind of bringing darkness into somewhere that was, you know, once full of light and positivity and kind of Christmas spirit. The mention of his name kind of completely contrasts that.
Yeah, and like, it's the legacy he's choosing to leave, isn't it? Like we said, that we mentioned that earlier in the last session, and it's not leaving a very positive one.
Yeah.
That's about it, really.
Right, guys, we'll see you next time.